Wrapping up the EDCF project implementation. Borrower's Guide for Preparing Project Completion Report, PCR. How do you do, everyone? Nice to meet you. I hope this presentation finds you well. Today's topic is Project Completion Report, PCR in short. Yes, it is that report which will appear at the end of the project, attacking you when you thought everything is over. Some of you may have never heard of it, and some of you may have experienced the report writing. PCR is the most ignored process in the EDCF project cycle. The excitement of a new project is gone, and the long project is finally over. You may want to move on. What have done is done, and let bygones be bygones. However, development intervention is a continuous process. Though the project is done, we all know that we have another task that will be built upon the results of the previous project. So, in this light, properly completing a project is as important as beginning a new project. Then how do we write one? This lecture is developed to help you with the process of PCR writing, a part of project completion. The lecture composes as follows. First, a general overview of PCR is given. In the second part, the contents of PCR explained item by item. And the third part, last but not least, will deal with some commonly occurring problems during the process of PCR writing. Let's begin with the introduction. This section contains the purpose of the lecture and introduction of PCR. This lecture is developed to introduce you to the importance of PCR and Borrower's Guide for Preparing PCR, which is designed to help you write PCR. Therefore, by the end of the lecture, it is expected for you to understand the purpose and importance of PCR in the EDCF project cycle and to be able to complete or guide a consultant to complete EDCF PCR. PCR is a requirement for EDCF-supported projects and programs. According to the Borrower's Guide for Preparing PCR, the borrower or project executing agency is required to submit a project completion report to the Export-Import Bank of Korea under the loan agreement between the borrower and the bank. The PCR is drawn up as of the date agreed on between the borrower and the bank and is submitted within 6 months from the date the project is completed. The PCR is a summary of project data, including performance and result at the time of completion. Let's summarize the lengthy statement in the previous slide. PCR is usually written by the borrower or project executing agency. An individual or a group of individuals who work as a consultant for the project would write the report, and it is submitted by the borrower or the project executing agency, depending on how it is specified in the loan agreement. EDCF expected PCR would be submitted within 6 months from the date the project is completed, signaling the end of the project implementation phase. However, sometimes PCR is overdue for various reasons. It may be forgotten or ignored by the partner country since, as we all know, the personnel is usually in very short supply and everyone would be involved in developing a new project. In some cases, PCR was submitted but not accepted due to the inconsistency in the report or lack of evidence. It does not seem very apparent what this report is for. Why do we even bother with it? Project Completion Report is a formal document which signaling the closing of a project. In EDCF-supported project cycle, it signals the completion of the project implementation. Usually, EDCF-supported project takes about 10 years or more to finish after the approval. Due to this lengthy timeline, record-keeping becomes an issue. And as we all know, if we don't remember, we would more likely to make the same mistakes over and over again. PCR as one document summarizes the process in one document. Also, this is the document in which the borrower can examine and explain the performance of partners, especially the contractors, consultants, and suppliers. The process of report writing provides all relevant parties to learn about the project and make them realize the things to be improved or worth duplicated. Even though PCR is the document that formally showing the project completion, it does not mean this is the end of the project. It only signals the implementation or production of the output phase of the project. At the time of PCR, the outcomes, the project's intended changes, would be at its early stage. Furthermore, long-term effects such as impact have not been fully realized. Therefore, PCR serves as a baseline for further change. Also, it is the beginning of the operations and maintenance of the infrastructure constructed by EDCF support. So, even with PCR, the work is not over. Continuous monitoring is crucial for the success of the project. Then what should be on PCR and how can it be done? You need 2 documents for PCR as your guide: Project Completion Report Form and the Guide for Preparing PCR. If you need to write PCR but do not have the guideline, then ask your EDCF counterpart to provide one or listen to this lecture. Before we begin, I would like to indicate that PCR form is not fixed or the same for all projects. You may add some of the information deemed necessary for your specific project. This form provides basic guidance for PCR only. Here's the list of items that usually appears on PCR. You find this list not so unusual since it resembles most of other development partners' PCR formats. Compared to other agencies' PCR, however, EDCF's one is more focused on the statements and description of what happened during the project implementation. In case of a discrepancy between the original plans and the actual results, the reasons should be presented in detail, including the situations encountered. If any problems have resulted from such discrepancy, such problems should be described, together with the measures taken and the results. For items unmodified, no modification or equivalent is to be stated. All the important problems which have arisen in implementing the project should also be indicated, with measures taken and the results. Each item should be explained by using various materials and documents, such as project progress reports. In addition, drawings and maps of the project site should be attached to PCR so EDCF has sufficient information on the implementation. The data and information on the overall project are contained in PCR, even if EDCF loan covers only a part of the project. As a lot of data and information is required in drawing up a complete PCR, the borrower should collect as much data and materials as possible on items in PCR form during the implementation period. Also, the borrower should indicate the source clearly when citing other sources. If the space provided in PCR form is insufficient, a separate sheet should be attached, explaining everything clearly. EDCF PCR usually begins with a project description. This article compares the original objectives, scope, and scale of the project with the actual implementation. The reader needs to understand what was planned and what has been actually done. In comparing the original plans with the actual results, the latter should correspond to what has already been stated about the former. If the original objectives have been changed, the reason for such changes should be described in paragraph 2, Modification, with complete background and conditions. If such changes have arisen after revising a basic plan, such as a national development plan, a superior plan, the discrepancy between the original and changed basic plans should be explained. If any statement in the original scope has been modified, the data should be entered in the column Revised Modified. The data after modification is in accordance with the column Item in the table, and if any item is deleted or a new item is added during the implementation of the project, such change should also be indicated in the columns Item and Revised Modified. If there has been any modification, including deletion and/or addition, to any of the items in the table Comparison of Original and Actual Scope, the reasons for such revision should be fully explained. For example, in case of modification of scope due to cost overrun, the reasons, amount, etc. of the cost overrun should be mentioned. Contribution of project to its relevant sectors or subsectors outlines the impact of the project on the socio-economic development of the country by reviewing the principal items of the project in its relevant sectors. In Table 3, Present Situation and Outlook for the Future, such items and contents, as descriptions of the sectoral investment plan already entered in Table 2, Original, should be mentioned. Outlook concerning the project, for example, the Superior Plan, such as the Sectoral Development Plan, should also be reported in Table 3, Present Situation and Outlook for the Future. This article compares the original plans with the actual results of the project implementation. It contains organization for implementing the project, implementation period, project cost, comments on performance of consultant, supplier, and other matters. Organization for implementing the project may include, in addition to the executing agency of the project, the procurement agency and the consultant. In the event of any change in the original plan, organization, function, and role, such a change and the reasons should be described in detail in the column 2, Changed. If any problem has arisen, such problem, with measures taken and the results, should also be described. Also, the latest organization chart or equivalent of the executing agency should be attached. Next is implementation period. First, the original schedule and actual period of implementation should be compared. Normally, the period required for procurement and duration of services is also included in the column Item. In principle, the actual date or period should be entered monthly in the column Actual Period with regard to each item. Any revision with regard to paragraph 2(1) of Article 1, comparison of original and actual scope, should be reflected in the above table. When there is any discrepancy with respect to items in the table in paragraph 2(1) of Article 2, comparison of original schedule and actual period, the reasons should be chosen from the list and explained in detail. Even if the work has progressed in accordance with the original schedule, matters deserving special mention should be described. With respect to each delay, it is necessary to describe both the concrete measures taken to catch up with the schedule and the results of the measures to prevent adverse effects on other stages. Particular attention should be paid to items where partial construction work schedules were set. After the time, we now move into the cost section. In principle, the actual expenditure should be entered in Table 2, Actual Expenditure. If any corresponding item is missing in Table 1, Original Estimated Expenditure, or if the project has been or will be expanded or equipment be altered, such expansion or alteration during the project life should be described, and the relevant data should be entered in Table 2, Actual Expenditure. Regarding local currency in Table 2, Actual Expenditure, it is necessary to check in subparagraph 3 whether it is the current price or the actual fixed price reassessed on a certain date, and clarify the exchange rate applied for conversion from foreign currency to local currency. If there is any difference between Table 1, Original Estimated Expenditure, and Table 2, Actual Expenditure in paragraph 1 with respect to local currency, foreign currency, and total, the reason should be indicated in the list and described in detail. In the event of cost overrun, both the measures taken, for example, reduced scope, additional financial expenditure, etc., and the results of such measures should be described. While the preceding paragraphs 1 to 3 deal with the cost of the project by individual item, this paragraph deals with the data by year for calculating the economic and financial effects of the project. The totals in Table 1, Original Estimated Expenditure, and Table 2, Actual Expenditure, dealt with in paragraph 1, therefore should equal to the totals in Table 1, Original Estimated Expenditure, and Table 2, Actual Expenditure dealt with here. This section provides detailed comments on the overall performance of the consultant, the contractor, and/or the supplier, in addition to comments on their activity. If there are any comments on the performance of the consultant, the contractor, and/or the supplier in any area other than the project scope, they should be stated separately. In this section, any other problems than those covered by sections on the project implementation should be described clearly with measures adopted and the results. For example, problems relating to procurement procedure or the organization for implementing the project. The purpose of PCR is to identify problems and addressing them for the improvement of future interventions. Even though it seems too cumbersome to write down for the past, it will serve as important data for future projects. Therefore, it is highly encouraged to give detailed description of the problems and their causes. This article deals with actions taken with regard to recommendations made by EDCF at the time of appraisal, loan agreement negotiations, or interim supervision and the results attained. For this section, first, the report writer should check the appropriate option for the project, applicable or not. Sometimes EDCF may fill in any recommendation before sending PCR forms. If the applicable option is selected, the description of the action taken and the results of the action should be given. Concerning each item recommended above, action taken, dates, contents, and the results should be described. If no action has been taken in accordance with such a recommendation, the reasons should also be presented. Alternatively or additionally, You can assess the initial outcome of the project using key performance indicators. This is a section that is not included in the Borrower's Guide for Preparing PCR. However, managing for sustainable development results principles should be applied to all processes of the project. At the end of the project, if the infrastructure built by EDCF support is functioning as expected, the initial outcomes should begin to appear. This is very important for all stakeholders to know whether these initial results are up to the target or not to manage the results leading toward the ultimate development result. Therefore, PCR should contain some indication on measurements of the infrastructure's initial performance, and it is highly recommended to include this section which presents the achievement of the project. This is the section presenting the key performance indicators. Outputs are listed in the article 1, Project Description. Impacts are included in the benefit analysis in the article 5, Benefits Derived from Project. Therefore, in this part of PCR, we are focusing more on the outcome indicators. Now, the actual results of key performance indicators are listed here. When you submit PCR, please provide the documents containing the data source. The indicators may be re-examined in the ex post evaluation of the project later. During this process, the evaluator needs to revisit the data source and use the data in PCR as the comparison point. Also, the objectivity and credibility of the data are one of the quality control measures for PCR. We all know, even with a very successful project, it is difficult to achieve all targeted goals for all outcome indicators. For some indicators, the results may not be achievable by the time of writing PCR. Therefore, PCR writer should explain in this section why some goals have been achieved and some have not been achieved yet for more effective result management of the infrastructure. If you want to leave out some of the indicators which deemed unnecessary, this is the part that you can specify the indicators and explain why it is not relevant to the project. This may occur due to the timing of PCR or changes in project scope. This article deals with the current state of the organization and method of operation and maintenance of the facilities after completion of the project. The condition of not only the facilities assisted by EDCF, but also the entire project should be explained. With respect to the facilities listed in the table, maintenance, management, operation, and utilization should be checked and described. If there have been any problems concerning these items, such problems should be described in detail with a full explanation of the reasons. The name of the agency or section in charge of operation and maintenance should be indicated here. The existing organization chart or equivalent should also be attached. The number of engineers and workers of each agency and/or section indicated in paragraph 1 should be listed, along with their specialties. The adequacy of the number of staff is an important factor for the sustainability of the project results, so it should be indicated based on the analysis. On-job or on-site training is important for the improvement of the staff capacity, especially when the staff employment was delayed before the training of O&M staff was sufficient during the project implementation. If the borrower has made or will make additional investment for expansion, replacement, or any other improvement purposes during the life of the project, the borrower should include the actual and currently expected expenditure for the maintenance of such facilities in Table 1. The concrete method of maintenance, its frequency, and supply of spare parts should be described. If there has been any problem in the implementation of maintenance, the problem should be explained in detail. This information is crucial for the sustainability of the project. Therefore, the method and encountered problems in O&M should be clearly stated. This article contains direct and indirect benefit of the project. This section deals with the basic data and information related to evaluating the financial and economic effects, for example, financial internal rate of return and economic internal rate of return, and the benefits derived from the project. Original expectation is based on the financial internal rate of return, FIRR, and the economic internal rate of return, EIRR, done before or at the beginning of the project. For preparation of the Table 2, Actual and Currently Expected Benefits, the actual value should be filled in if already available, and if not, the expected value for the future portion should be clearly indicated. Where a large discrepancy exists between the Table 1, Original Expected Benefits, and the Table 2, Actual and Currently Expected Benefits, The reasons and the results should be carefully analyzed. While the above Section 1 of the Article 5 deals with the direct effects, such as an economic, this section deals with indirect effects. Items applicable to this category are listed in the corresponding part of PCR form. They should be stated concretely. For example, creation of employment for 300 people, etc. Any adverse effect, such as destruction of the environment, should also be described clearly, if any. This article covers the borrower's conclusions regarding the project, taking into consideration of suggestions given by the executing agency whether the purpose of the project was successfully accomplished or not, in the light of direct and indirect effects. The conclusion of PCR form doesn't specify what to write or give you any structure. This is the section in which you can express your view on the project implementation and partner performances. So, it usually contains the following: the extent to which the project's objective has been accomplished, overall evaluation of the project from the formulation to completion stage, the principal lessons learned, with implications on other projects, at each stage of the project and preparation of PCR, current status of the associated or auxiliary projects which influence the effectiveness of the project benefits, and any other aspects on which the borrower wishes to comment concerning the project. Here are lists of common problems in PCR writing and some advice for addressing them. Usually, the rejection, which is painful to both parties, happens due to either discrepancy in information, especially in numbers, or inadequate evidence. Please check the numbers before the submission, especially for the consistency between the different sections of PCR. The discrepancy is expected due to the long project cycle. It usually takes about 10 years to complete a project. Exchange rates and their reference document should be indicated in PCR. This is not a serious issue. Since EDCF PCR is very flexible in its format, you can include your government's requirements. However, you should notify EDCF partners and let them know what is expected. Also, please try to accommodate the information which is important for EDCF too. PCR writing is usually the job of the consultant hired for your project. It means you have to include this in the terms of references for your consultant. Sometimes, PCR is not included in any of the consultant or expert's terms of reference because it seems so far away at the beginning of the project. This will create a lot of problems at the end of the project. It is usually very difficult to write PCR without a consultant, so make sure it is included in the terms of reference for them. Also, please ensure enough time to examine the quality of PCR before the contract ends, since oftentimes PCR draft requires revision. This lecture ends here. Like all EDCF-supported projects, this lecture has a specific goal, helping you understand the importance of PCR and easing the process of writing one. I hope this lecture helped you as it was intended. Thank you for listening.